Well, hello YouTube, it's me, Fortmaster, and welcome back to another LazerPig reaction. It has been so long since I've done one of these. Mainly because he's been posting mostly, like a lot of like podcast stuff, or basically things that don't do well in like reaction form. Because like I know reactions may be classified as like one of the very low rungs on YouTube content, but I'm not going down that low. I don't know if anybody watching this has seen, but LazerPig actually posted a meme using something that I made. So basically, if you hadn't seen actually, how long ago was it? Yeah, so a month ago, the Tank Museum did one of their, bring some famous person in and have them talk about their top 5 favorite tanks. And they had LazerPig come in, and not only that, we actually get to see him in the flesh in this video.
Hi, my name is LazerPig.
Very exquisite costuming, might I add. But yeah, after that, at the end of the video, he's walking towards the camera, talking about, support the Tank Museum on Patreon and stuff like that.
I know everything because of that, and if you disagree, I'm here, you're not.
So anyway, when this video came out, I loved it, but also I loved this last part. So I did a little work finding like websites and a little bit of editing myself, and I made this on the Reddit.
I know everything because of that, and if you disagree.
And that got pretty popular, so I'm going to sound a little selfish here and say, I hoped that I'd see some more memes of it pop up on the subreddit. It didn't. Hey, what are you going to do? But then a couple of days later, I saw this on Twitter.
I know everything because of that, and if you disagree, I'm here, you're not.
So yeah, I don't care what other people say about me. I've won. So yeah, with all that aside, let's actually begin talking about the actual subject of today's video. LazerPig's video, Stealth, a controversy. So yeah, that's not incredibly vague at all. And I thought I'd go into the description to see, if he talks about it anymore. And all it says is, this video may annoy a lot of Serbians. Yeah. So, to say I'm confused. But yeah, initially I thought this was going to be like a video talking about like myth busting and the truths of like actual, stealth combat, like stealth fighters and like radar deflection, that sort of stuff. But the whole Serbian line in the description, that's completely thrown me off. So yeah, I'm going into this pretty much blind now, aren't I? Hopefully anybody watching this actually knows what the video is and you're not watching me first for some reason. So yeah. With all that out of the way, original video is linked in the description if you haven't seen it for some reason. Corner video will lead to my Let's Play of the day, as well as the second part of this reaction as well, because the normal video is almost an hour and a half long. This is most likely going to be a two-parter. And if you like any of the stuff I put out, whether it's like reactions or Let's Plays or anything really, I would very much like it if you'd subscribe. It just helps the channel out. We're almost at 2,000. At the time of recording, I'm like at 1,959 subscribers. So yeah, if I could hit like 2,000 before the end of the month, I mean, that'd be pretty cool. Yeah, with all that out of the way, let's get this thing actually started then, shall we?
Hello, I'm LazerPig.
Hi, LazerPig.
Military expert and all-round bit of an idiot. I've always been obsessed with history, even from an early age where history books and DVDs were a common gift on Christmas and birthdays, which honestly I much preferred over gift boxes of deodorant and eau de toilette, whatever the fuck that is. You may have shared a similar experience. Do people still buy DVDs?
No, because you can't find them anywhere. At least not the good ones. Like, I'm like, last I heard, I think Best Buy is like gearing down to stop selling physical media at all, which sucks. But the problem for me is like, I am mostly, like a PC gamer, sort of like that. So for games at the very least, like everything is just digital nowadays. They don't sell physical like games anymore. Remember, I forget when, But like sometime during high school, I got the entire box set of Monty Python's Flying Circus on DVD. I still have it. It's downstairs in the basement.
I don't know. I'm not down with the kids. I have no idea what they do. And whatever they do scares me. But since my discovery of the Reformers and the fighter-plane mafia back in 2013,
God, not these losers
my
again.
subject of interest moved away from the Second World War and big armor boxes with guns in them, fascinating though they are. And instead, I spent many a night, pot of coffee in one hand, bottle of wine in the other. Alright, more wine than coffee. Alright, fine, I had a bottle of wine in both hands, okay? Point is, I ventured deeper and deeper into this weird-ass rabbit hole of a fairly recent history that so many people just don't seem to know about, despite happening literally just a few years ago. These men, this self-proclaimed fighter-plane mafia, lied to the public for years, all to further their careers and financial gain, doing what so many children on the internet do by proclaiming they had some hand in developing some of America's most famed weapons. And they got completely away with it. Up until his death, Pierre Sprey was still considered the lead designer of the A10, the F15, and even the F16, in spite of being involved in none of these projects. John Boyd claimed he designed the F-15, and yet had almost nothing to do with it. I mean, yes, he was involved in a very early design spec phase, but his ideas were scrapped after the advent of the MiG-31, and the plane that would become the F-15 was completely redesigned from the ground up. Colonel James Burton would always proclaim that the Bradley was a work of Pentagon corruption, in spite of himself being arguably the most corrupt, career-motivated, and money-wasting element of the entire program. And Spiny got an award for his services to the government from the Pogo Foundation, the foundation he helped found.
At that point, is that even nepotism or just plain pure corruption?
All he did while still working at the Pentagon was to send over 500 emails to various people over the years, blasting them for their critique of the fighter plane mafia, several of which were sent to the editor of the Air Force magazine, in which he referred to him as intellectual slime, for daring to point out that in Spiny's report where he claimed the defense budget of the United States was 5 times what it had been in Vietnam, shock horror, he had forgotten about inflation.
There's a reason why you can't go to college, buy a house, and raise a family on, like, a single income from, like, some factory somewhere anymore. At least not in North America.
The one question I have constantly asked myself is why? Why have these men been allowed to get away with this shit for as long as they have? I mean, yes, the Air Force is still to a point obsessed with Boyd, even if it is just his fellow PowerPoint commandos, but surely there were
PowerPoint commandos
time who would have known what he was saying was bullshit, knew he and Sprey had absolutely nothing to do with the projects they claimed ownership of. Heck, when Pentagon Wars was published, and even when it was being converted into a film, the generals Burton was talking about were all still alive, and would have known damn fine he was nothing but a career monkey out for blood. So why say nothing? Why let the fighter plane mafia continue their bullshit rampage to the point where any private snafu, disillusioned from the propaganda trip that roped him into serving, genuinely believes the US military and the Pentagon are more corrupt and more self-serving than the fucking Kremlin? Now, I have a theory. Of course, it's just a theory. It sounds plausible, but ultimately, I have no idea if it's true or not. And considering it's about the US military, it could be just as equally true as it is untrue, or anywhere in between. Let me explain. After years digging through archives, books, declassified reports, emails, and even opinion pieces by those around at the time, in search for information about the fighter plane mafia and the true depths of this almost calm they've been running since the 50s, the name of a certain aircraft keeps popping up. Now, this aircraft, the Reformers absolutely hate it. For years, they waged an intense war against it remaining in active service, and when it was finally retired, they celebrated it as a victory. You should, of course, know what it is, being as it's one of my favorite planes. Now, I know I say that a lot.
Which one is
I say
that?
About almost every single plane I ever see. The Vulcan, for example, the Harrier, the MiG-29, the jet. But one has always stood out. I had a picture of one as a kid. I had models of the damn thing. I even had this big one you could stick little action figures in, and this bike came out the side.
Oh!
I don't know why it did that, but it did. I had a weird child.
Wait, so, oh god, I'm forgetting what this one's called. Oh no, it's the one that was like, it was kind of like the companion or something, or a predecessor to the B1, wasn't it? Ah, God, I'm completely forgetting its name.
Where played with dolls, but in my defense, they were action dolls with guns and stabby things and makeup.
Action Man.
There was action makeup for camouflage, you know, for jungles and swamps, and the after party at the ambassadorial reception where you needed to look your best, otherwise you'd cause a diplomatic scandal, and no one wants that.
Nope.
Slowing down at 3-in-1 Roller Extreme Action Man.
That plane, of course, was the F117.
F117, that was it.
My absolute favorite aircraft of all time, which you probably should know because it was in the title of the video.
LazerPig, why do you lie?
Were you thinking it was something else? Can you not read? In spite of only being revealed to the public in 1988, the Nighthawk became a symbol of the 80s and is quite possibly the most iconic
Black
aircraft
and pointy.
of all time. There is nothing in the world that looks quite like it. It is instantly identifiable to even the most brain-dead of individuals. Even the ones who lurk on internet forums using the name and profile picture of some 1940s German general, arguing that the Challenger 2 cannot possibly be a good tank because the armor isn't sloped.
This is not a joke. I've generally seen people say that. Because its armor is not slow. I'm sorry, what? Yeah, just not gonna get into it. Nope.
It's going to potentially fire up the tattered remains of that one remaining brain cell, and with just a little bit of effort and quite a lot of energy drink, might just be able to identify this as an F117 before launching into a rant about the heart and hoe, which I've already covered. Granted, in a video that makes me sound like I'm recording it at the bottom of a well, because I recorded all of my old videos in a microphone that I stole from a karaoke bar. I was very poor back then.
Wait, really? I hope you returned it at the very least.
I'm not covering it again, okay? But what is the F-117? Why is it important? Why do the reformers hate it so much? And what has it got to do with Pierre Spray and my theory?
Well, one, it was a stealth fighter. Two, they hated it because it was new and used modern technology, because for some reason modern technology is just automatically worse. And three, he actually designed it and he hated himself for it.
Well, the F-117 is a stealth fighter.
Check
we
one.
call it a fighter, but it doesn't do the actual fighting that you'd typically expect of a fighter plane. It doesn't, fight other fighters. I mean, not really. I mean, some former F-117 pilots have spoken about the plane having sidewinders on improvised rails and flying around at night trying to see if they can shoot something down, but, well, no records if they did that or not have ever been released to the public, so if or not that's true, well, your guess is as good as mine. So, it doesn't fight other planes. It was never designed to do it. So what does it fight? Well, this plane fights the ground. Or rather, what's on the ground.
Wait, so it's Cass? Really? Okay, so I think, okay, now I'm getting it. This has some sort of weird connection to the A10, doesn't it? Wait, yeah, that would make sense for it being stealth, because then you can't have radar detecting it, and it's more, a surprise, so that the ground forces can't prepare for it and, have a better chance of not defending against it.
You see, for thousands of years, militaries have typically kept important things that they need on the ground. Things like barracks and ammo depots, and there's a good reason for this. It's cheap, it's there, and it avoids either having to build a large network of tunnels or mess around with the logistics of balloons. Ground is also where people live, and where their stuff is. And if you're the military of a country, your country's people and your country's stuff is...
And your country itself is on the ground.
It's typically what you're trying to stop other countries from stealing. So it's pretty good to have your military nearby in case that happens. Now, at some point, someone realizes planes are a thing. When you're in a plane, you could fight things that were on the ground, but because you weren't on the ground, and typically everything on the ground is designed to fight things that are also on the ground, it has a kind of hard time getting to you, who isn't on the ground. Now, this gives you a huge advantage. So a plane has the amazing ability to fly over the ground and not have to deal with anything that was, say, in the way of like a regular army, like walls or trenches or minefields. And in fact, you can fly all the way past all that bullshit and fight things on the ground that typically weren't expecting to have to fight that day. Things like a factory, because a factory is a building that's on the ground. So it can't fight you, who is not on the ground.
Wait, the first in World War One, didn't the beginning of bombing? Well, actually, the very first ones, or some of the first ones, are done by Zeppelin. Also, some of the ones done on early planes, weren't they literally just like the pilot dropping grenades off the side of the plane or something before they had like dedicated bombers. I think that's how that worked. Like I can just oh god, that sounds terrifying on so many levels.
That gives you a huge advantage. Now,
Oh, yeah.
we have a word for things like that, which is bomber. So why is this a fighter and not a bomber? Why isn't it the B-117? Well, I looked into it, and the official explanation seems to be... No, seriously, there are theories. One theory, which seems to be the most plausible, is they recruited fighter pilots to fly these things, because it's a single-seater and it flies like a fighter, which bomber pilots wouldn't be used to. And a fighter pilot might get upset if they had to degrade themselves to flying a bomber. Fighter pilots fly fighters. They don't fly bombers. Bombers are big and slow and don't do all the super cool maneuvers you see in Top Gun. Bombers aren't exciting. Now, fighters are exciting. Fighters can fight things that fight back, so it's far more noble and adventurous.
But this thing couldn't fight back, and you know, I want to say that would be really stupid, but at the same time, knowing people, that is entirely the reason why it was called that. I mean, morale is always an important thing. If the enemy's hurt, what's more important than stopping the enemy from hurting your morale? Keeping your own side from hurting your own morale. So I mean, if you can like give the pilots a fancy name to make sure they keep their spirits up and they fight better, I mean, you're doing something right.
Like bombers who fight things that don't fight back, like buildings and civilians and war crimes and stuff. Like there's a hierarchy in military aviation. It goes fighters, bombers, and then transport. I mean, okay, there's a bit of an overlap. Like the pilots of MH6 Littlebirds, for example. Helicopter pilots are somewhat not super respected by the Air Force. Notably because due to interdepartmental politics, they are mostly run by the Army. Because the Army needed aircraft, and the Air Force decided that everything that was a plane was their jurisdiction. So if the Army needed close air support, they had to call the Air Force, who could turn around and say, no. And the Army thought that was a stupid idea, so they built a flying machine that wasn't a plane, and this turned out to be a really good idea. But if I'm going to be 100% honest...
Interdepartmental politics is like... granted, I hope that like modern military, specifically in like the US and stuff like that, it isn't as bad as like, say, like World War II Japan, where you had literally like the Navy and the Army fighting for resources, and then the Navy and the Army having their own independent air forces as well.
With you having seen a Little Bird in action, these guys have half an inch of glass protecting their entire body from death. They have a minigun and like a rocket pod or something,
Ooh.
And they just find the target and they fly in close to it. I mean, so close. If you're a guy in a trench and then a little bird's coming at you, they get so close you could reach in and punch the pilot. That's how close they get. And they come back with no ammo and the biggest smile on their face, and just this trail of devastation.
Much braver men than I'll tell you that.
Glass, protecting their balls from a bullet. I would not want to fuck with any of these guys.
No, definitely
Anyway,
not.
Rambling. So the F-117 is not a fighter, it's a bomber. It's labeled as a fighter, but it doesn't do what fighters do. It do what bombers do. So what does the stealth part mean? Well, stealth, in lieu of any nonsensical, overly detailed explanation as given by various fancy dictionaries and websites, is the art of not being seen.
Yeah, of course!
Seen, the enemy can't shoot at you. This is why the F-117 is black and flies at night. Night is dark. You can't see very well in the dark, especially if what you're looking for is also dark. Only the superior American mind could think of such things.
Oh god, that's so stupid. But yeah, but also isn't that part of the reason for the shape? Like, it's all triangular and stuff, so that if it's hit by radar, the radar gets sent everywhere else except back to the receiver. And also, what was it covered in? I think, was it covered in like some sort of like energy or radar absorbing paint or something? Or am I thinking of a different plane? I know there have been like several planes that have done that where like they're covered in like radar absorbing like rubbery paint or something that literally just absorbs like some of the energy.
Okay, it's more than that. It's not stealthy because they painted it black. Okay, look, this is going to take some time to explain.
I mean, partially, I would imagine.
Why stealth? You need to understand why is stealth important.
Well, I mean, as you said before, why is stealth important? Because if you can kill them before they know you're even there, the chances of you returning home alive increase dramatically. I mean, that's part of the reason why snipers are, like, a thing, because... Actually, that's part of the reason why just ranged combat in general is a thing. I mean, if you can... The farther away you can kill them, the less likely that they can kill you.
Since the 1950s, the development of aircraft focused largely around the deployment of nuclear bombs, dropped from very long-range bombers, which were expected to operate well outside the range of surface weapons, which at the point were largely big guns that could put objects from the ground into the air, where planes are, and
Radar-assisted ammunition that explode when close.
planes don't typically like that. But those guns had maximum ranges of maybe 25,000 feet. A modern bomber could fly at 40,000 feet and above, meaning these guns were pretty much useless. If you wanted to hit something that high up with a gun, you'd need a really, really big gun, like an impractically sized gun. And then bombers could just fly higher.
You go like the Yamato and have like an 18-inch anti-aircraft gun. I can imagine that being absolutely awesome to look at, but like, geez, that would suck to load. Also, like, the fire rate would be horrible.
So what was the point? Everything was built around the logic that bombers were king. The bomber would always get through no matter what. This led to such wonderful trains of thought, mostly from certain members of the US Air Force, that the other divisions of the US military, mostly the Army, were completely unnecessary, as the Air Force could bomb any threat into total submission. Therefore, the US Army doesn't need that huge budget. Wouldn't it be great if the Air Force had it instead? Think of what we could build. This idea...
Well, unfortunately, it's not the Air Force that comes in and, you know, actually takes enemy targets. I mean, yeah, I mean, it's all fair and good to, you know, just blow it up, but at the same time, I mean, if you're that far away, you leave, they can start rebuilding and fixing stuff. You need people on the ground to stop them from doing that.
Doozy came to a crashing halt when, in 1960, the Soviets shot down a U-2 spy plane that had been flying at an altitude of 70,000 feet, presumed to be well above the altitude that Soviet fighters could fly at. And technically, it was. The U-2 was not shot down by a fighter.
Missile.
It had been shot down by a surface-to-air system, a missile. And like many things in the
There
US
you go.
military, this caused an argument. In fairness, the writing had been on the wall for quite some time that something like this would happen. Joint war games with the Brits had found the English Electric Lightning could not only easily intercept U-2 spy planes, but even exceed them in flight ceiling when pushed. It was blatantly obvious that the days of nuclear bombers were numbered, but a close-knit group within the ranks of the Air Force, dubbed the Bomber Mafia, ignored the sign.
Of course they were called the Bomber Mafia. There's always these groups, and I mean, I can partially understand you don't want to lose your power, but at the same time, like, I don't understand these people how in, like, good conscience, they'll do this kind of stuff and, like, hold back progress and, like, hold on to, like, more antiquated technologies and, like, styles of thought so that they can be more in power at the cost of, you know, people's lives. Never understand it.
After the U-2 incident, the Air Force would separate into two separate camps. One side believed that fighter bombers would be the future of the Air Force, and those who believed in the separation of bombers and fighters, and that fighters should remain a dedicated air superiority role. Over the years, those two camps would slowly start to dominate thinking within the Pentagon, and oddly enough, both were equally justified.
But then you realize that the intercontinental ballistic missile becomes a thing, and then bombers sort of go by the wayside. Wait, trying to think, how many dedicated bombers, like, are there still in militaries? Like, the only one that I know off by heart is, like, the B-52. Are there any others? Actually, let me look this up. Rockwell B-1 Lancer. Never heard of this before. Okay. World War I, World War II, Cold War, post-Cold War, Stratofortress, the B-52, Stratofortress, the B-2, yeah, B-1. Oh, so I got the B-1. I called the B-2 a B-1 by accident. I'll just remember that. Russian. Oh yeah, that. Yeah, the Tu-95, T-160. H-20, B-21 Raider. Okay, yeah, so there are still, like, dedicated strategic bombers and stuff like that. Okay, there you go.
The U-2 incident had caused major concerns within the minds of the first group. They believed air superiority could never be achieved unless ground-based anti-air systems could also be taken out, without the need of large bombers. But the second group believed that the inclusion of equipment required to facilitate a ground attack role would compromise the fighter's ability to, well, fight. Heavy equipment on a plane could compromise speed and maneuverability, and in the dogfight, if you couldn't maneuver, if you couldn't get your speed up, you were dead.
Dead, yeah, exactly.
And in fairness, they had a point. This was the 1960s. Ground attack meant heavy rocket pods and bombs and cannons. Not really something you want on a fighter plane. Now, the two sides would eventually agree to compromise, and the resulting aircraft would be the F-15. A topic for another video because, you know, we'll get to that.
Just every... What I'm learning at this point is just that every vehicle from the Cold War, it seems, is just a topic for its own video because they are such a quagmire of, like, internal politics and, like, strange development histories and stuff like that. Oh, LazerPig has years of content just from the Cold War alone.
We'll get to that. But while all this was going on, there was a problem about what to do with all these bombers. In the USSR, development had begun to shift away from bombers and more towards long-range ballistic missiles, and the US was looking to do the same. And this kinda had a knock-on effect. Most notably, a large supercarrier called the United States class, designed to carry and launch nuclear-armed bombers, was cancelled. This led to a revolt within the Naval Admiralty and cemented the feud between the Navy and the Air Force, because though the Navy's bomber fleet was axed, the Air Force's was not. The bomber...
Oh god, I've heard of the United States before, but I didn't know it was big enough to launch bombers from.
Mafia were still too strong an influence within the walls of the Pentagon, and they were not going to accept the decommissioning of the nuclear bomber fleet, even though now it was theoretically useless. But even then, their influence was dwindling. The ideology of the bomber will always get through was now being seriously questioned, and with the bomber mafia ruling the roost for so long, sub-factions within the Air Force, sensing weakness, were starting to circle like sharks.
Well,
in order to stay on top, the bomber mafia needed to keep the idea of long-range bombers relevant, and the suggestion on how to tackle this problem came from a very unexpected place.
Okay, who?
Looking for a cheaper solution than expensive long-range missile systems, Britain had tested the idea of flying bombers at low altitudes. Now, only one of their bombers could actually do this, the Vulcan. The other two bombers in the V fleet were built for high-altitude maneuvers, and operating for too long at low altitude caused serious fatigue on the hull. But the Vulcan was different. It was able to keep low, and its design meant it was somewhat difficult to keep track of on older radar systems. The Brits began training Vulcan crews on how to navigate at low altitude. It was re-equipped with stronger wings, terrain-following radar, and larger air intakes, and though it had never been designed for such a role, and many higher-ups in the British military doubted it would have ever worked, during trials and exercises, the low-altitude Vulcan proved fairly successful. The bomber mafia took note of this. They could develop a new bomber that was capable of low-altitude attacks, and the project would be saved. Now this is where things start to get weird.
How? What is happening?
The Navy's rebellion had been largely successful. While they didn't end up with the United States bomber carrier design, they did end up with the Forrestal, probably the most iconic of America's carriers, with the last one finally being decommissioned in 1998. But the Navy wanted their own nuclear bomber. This was entirely a political move to remain competitive when it came to funding, so not wanting another rebellion on their hands, Congress agreed, and the Navy ended up with the A3D Sky Warrior. Well, originally they had the AG Savage, which wins points for style, but was so heavy and cumbersome that it couldn't fit onto most carriers. Everyone hated it, and it was found that if it did drop an A-bomb, the plane wasn't fast enough to outrun the blast.
So basically, it filled in, like, every category, then.
It was basically a suicide mission, which, incidentally, most people are not particularly fond of. So
no, yeah, I wouldn't think so.
The way forward. Now, the Air Force saw this, got jealous, and wanted their own, so they asked for a ground-based variant of the Sky Warrior. and in theory, this would have been an easy conversion. Add in ejector seats, take off the hooks, and remove the reinforced struts needed for carrier landings. But because the Air Force was the Air Force and the Navy wouldn't share, this conversion took far longer and was far more expensive than it should have been. And though visually similar, the resulting B-66 destroyer was completely different in almost every respect.
Again, interdepartmental politics. It ruins everything. Nothing ever good comes from it.
Then, as is quite typical of the time period, the Soviets did a thing. The thing in question was the Tu-16, a long-range twin-engine jet bomber. Now, the Navy started to become a little bit concerned by the Tu-16. It believed that these bombers were fast, in fact so fast, by the time the radar of a ship had detected them, their interceptors wouldn't have enough time to, well, intercept. And it was very possible that if the Soviets launched these nuclear-armed bombers against a carrier fleet, then there was little the fleet could actually do to stop them. They needed a solution. The result for the Navy was the F-16 Missileer. Now again, this was not a fighter. It was not designed to dogfight or attack other fighters. It was built to fight bombers. Thus, it was built to fly high, be slow, but importantly, stick around for a long time in the same area and wait for the bombers to come to them, and then shoot them down with a very novel idea.
Missiles!
Long-range radar-guided missile. Now, this pisses a lot of people off, mostly the Air Force, since intercepting bombers is supposed to be their job, and they don't have a shiny new missile plane to do it, so they want their own one. But the Missileer doesn't have a gun, so when it runs out of missiles, it has no choice but to go home, to a carrier that's about to be nuked. This defies convention. Since missiles are new, many see them as a bit of an expensive fad, an unreliable wonder weapon. And again, this is the 1960s, they were kinda right. In order to get a lock-on with its missiles, the Missileer had to get within visual range of the target, and then drop out of visual range before firing to give the missile enough time to activate. Now this wasn't technically a fault of the system. The Missileer
Just
could lock
technology
on
at the
and fire
time.
things it couldn't see. It was a fault of doctrine. Beyond visual range combat wasn't really a thing. And since radars of the time couldn't really identify exactly what it was looking at, there was a slight chance the fast, large flying jet bomber you were looking at was actually one of those new jet airliners that were becoming all the rage. So the pilot had to visually identify the target before firing. But a lot of people, most notably the reformers, who like to smugly state this fact at any presented opportunity, tend to forget about that bit. Now, as per usual,
of course,
this caused something of an argument. And into that argument steps one Robert McNamara. McNamara is a character that deserves a video all in his own, but there are better people working on that, so I'll skip the majority of the politics that surround him. McNamara was a bit of a maverick, in that he did what he wanted, and he liked to piss off the top brass as much as physically possible. Because of this, most of the good he did never received due credit, and instead he went down in history as the stupid person you giggle at in your podcast when you're talking about Vietnam. Needless to say, talking to almost any Air Force veteran about him will encourage wrath. But regardless of what you think of him, McNamara stepped into a position to find three branches of the same military all fighting each other. They all had their own designations for things, their own way of doing things. No one wanted to share, there was almost no standardization, and everyone thought they could easily win any war if the other two branches would kindly stop hogging all the funding and let them build a Death Star. McNamara looked at the Missileer and found the concept to be needlessly outdated and expensive. I mean, it was basically replacing an early warning radar system with a plane that needed fuel and had a pilot who would be sat circling for hours until the next plane came along to replace him. It was a huge cost of manpower and resources. But on top of that, the Air Force's own bomber fleet was not exactly up to modern standards. The B-47 Stratojet, though one of the most drop-dead gorgeous aircraft in the world,
it does look very pretty,
had the tendency to blow up in midair, all by itself. And for reasons completely unknown to the Air Force at the time, McNamara decided that this was problematic. What he wanted...
Yeah, like, who would guess that, spontaneous rapid disassembly of your aircraft while in the middle of operation would be a bad thing?
Was a cheaper solution in the form of a joint aircraft, a single plane that could fulfill the needs of both the Air Force and the Navy, one that was interchangeable and would only require slight modification. Now that in itself was
sounds genius!
Easy, and most people today just aren't aware of how bad the inter-force rivalry was between the three main branches. Individual generals held a lot of influence and power, and their ability to move funds around for personal projects would make today's Russian oligarchs weep for joy. They would even initiate projects projects just to spite other branches. An example being the A10, which started life as a spite project because the Air Force didn't want to use a Navy design, and the F-14 because the Navy didn't want to use an Air Force design, and the Comanche stealth attack helicopter because the Army wanted to do everything by itself.
Again, I remember when I first saw that in, like, what was it, on like Discovery Channel or something? I thought that was so cool. I want to hear like the specifics of why that thing never, like, quote unquote took off, because quite frankly, I mean, like, that still looks like really modern and cool looking.
Getting all these people together in a room to agree on a single aircraft was somewhat akin to having Margaret Thatcher and Gerry Adams shake hands. The required jet, according to Air Force and Navy, would need to be capable of going supersonic, be equipped with advanced missile systems, be capable of dropping nukes, operate from carriers, perform surveillance missions, interceptions, regular patrols, strategic bombing, and electronic warfare, as well as be able to maneuver at both high and low altitudes. Now this was problematic.
Yeah, I'm starting to see where the problems come in when you have that huge laundry list of things that you all want a single design to do. Granted, I can imagine you could have like slight variances of like designs, like one for the Navy where it can do certain things better than the other. I mean, you're almost, for me, that almost sounds like you're getting into jack of all trades, master of none territory.
To cut the long and very boring science lesson short, the air is thick. The faster you go, the more it pushes back, and thus the more powerful an engine you need to maintain speed.
And then you get to like supersonic speeds where you get to the point where the air physically can't move out of your way fast enough. Then you have to, you have like a long pointed edge, so you're basically cutting the air in half.
And thus the more fuel you'll consume. So you need big
more
wings to create a
fuels.
lot of downforce. Because the more downforce you have, the more lift you have, and the faster, I'm simplifying, but bear with me, you will theoretically turn. Get that mixture wrong and you end up with the Lockheed F104 Starfighter, the worst plane ever made. Do not worry, I will get to that.
He's making a lot of like promises here that I really hope he does get to that.
We'll all get to that. The problem with building a plane like this is sometimes planes need to go high, and the higher up you are, the thinner the air gets.
There is, yeah.
Up there, having big air-breathing engines is not a good idea. There's just not enough air to feed them. They tend to get very hot and do things like melt or catch fire. And though you can fly faster with much less fuel, those big wings you have are going to cause
a lot of drag.
If you attempt to maneuver them the same way at that speed, they're going to snap off. What you want is swept back wings, but that offers low maneuverability at low altitudes and can make the aircraft very unstable at low speeds. This is the big problem that fighter aircraft designers are always faced with. What altitude do you design your planes to operate in, high or low? If you get it wrong, you end up with the Falkland scenario, where the British Air Force and Harriers, designed for low altitude operations, absolutely kicked the ass out of the Argentinian Air Force, who had things like the Mirage 3, high altitude fighters, who got outmaneuvered when they tried to engage the British at low altitude. Now, there are ways around this. Typically, high altitude aircraft have an advantage over low altitude simply because of height and the ability to dive bomb an opponent. But when you have a bomber
a lot of potential energy,
radar sites and mountains, having an ability to remain maneuverable at low altitude is not an advantage you can afford to lose. So what the fuck do you do here? Well, many ideas are proposed. The Air Force considered a plane that could be held within a larger plane and then detach its supersonic shell to go subsonic when needed. This would be a waste of material and would leave parts of an expensive plane all across a foreign power's territory. So the Navy came up with an idea of having a plane that could...
Yeah, what is it with these designs that just have huge sections of them that are just like sacrificial and only temporary? I mean, like, just for one, that would be so expensive to maintain, where you'd have to every time the plane came back, you'd have to like reattach all the supersonic stuff onto it. Like, that would be so wasteful.
Transform instead, folding its wings back into itself to create a sort of wedge shape that would allow it to remain maneuverable and fast at high altitude. And as very typical, that's when the arguments began. The Navy wanted their own plane that could carry huge fuel loads without the need for external pods. They also didn't want ejector seats because those were an Air Force thing. Instead, they wanted an escape pod, which they actually got. The Air Force wanted the aircraft to be thinner and have tandem seating with two separate radar displays. The Navy wanted side-by-side seating so the pilots could share a radar screen. The Navy wanted it to go Mach 2, the Air Force Mach 2.3. The Air Air Force demanded it handle 7G, and the Navy wanted this preposterously huge radar put into it. On and on this went. Numerous companies attempting to entertain both sets of designs, and almost all were rejected.
And then I'm just imagining you have the Army just off to the sidelines, just fiddling with their stuff, creating a new helicopter. I mean, at this point, it's almost sounding like you have like a pair of children fighting. This is just getting sad.
Outside of Boeing, Boeing had created a design that, in some bizarre miracle, both branches liked. It did everything they both wanted it to do, but then McNamara came in, and he didn't like it. The problem with Boeing's concept was that it shared very little components between the Air Force and the Navy's design. It was effectively two separate aircraft, which would limit the ability for both branches to standardize.
Wait, so there was that much difference between the two variants? Okay.
This was not what he wanted, so he told them to try again, and again, and again. And in spite of finally having committee approval, in spite of having both branches ready to shake hands on Boeing's design, McNamara instead chose the design of General Dynamics. This turned out to be a good thing, because in 1964, General Dynamics would achieve perfection.
That is loud! That's a very nice looking plane, though.
The resulting F111 was one of the most successful bombers of its day, and the reformers absolutely hated it. Yeah.
Of course they did, because they're all idiots, and it wasn't mine, so it's not good.
It was an F111 video the entire time. I pulled a sneaky on you. The reformers believed that aircraft didn't need radar or fancy electronics, that precision bombing was just a fantasy, and that missiles were unreliable wonder weapons that could never beat the gun and the clever pilot. But the F111 proved otherwise. Its ability to strike at targets with laser precision earned it the nickname the Air Assassin. In fact, it was so good at precision bombing it would beat the reformers' champion, the A10 Warthog, at the one thing it was designed to do: tank busting. In fact, during Operation Desert Storm, it would fly more sorties and rack far more kills than any other plane. In fact, the F111s were switched to a tank hunting role in order to compensate for the poor performance of the A10s. The F111s could operate at night, which...
Wait a second, are the F111s still in service? Because the A10s still are. Okay, so why is the F111 retired, but the A10 still in service if the A10, like, sucks so bad? Like, I know the A10 looks cool and sounds cool with its giant minigun, but, like, if it sucked so bad at doing its job, why didn't they keep this thing in? Hopefully LazerPig explains that.
Which was not something the A10s could do. They could fly in bad weather, which was not something the A10s could do. And they had the uncanny ability to recognize the difference between an Iraqi truck and a British scimitar tank. Again, not something the A10 could do. This infuriated the reformers, who tried to label it the pig, fat and slow, something F111 pilots would wear as a badge of honor, officially adopting the name F111 Adar in 1996. Sorry, F111 Adar. You happy? I said it. And though the reformers have done a successful job at thrashing the reputation of the F111, it was not a plane without its faults. It was expensive, and it was considered by ground crews to be an absolute maintenance nightmare. In fact, it's no surprise when the F111 was finally retired, the suicide rates among ground crew chiefs dropped significantly. But was it really...
Okay, so I can kind of see now why it was retired before the A10. Okay, thank you for explaining that. But also, wait, what the whole thing about, like, ground chief, like, suicide rates, is he being, like, is that a joke, or is he being actually serious? Like, was this thing so hard to maintain that it actually caused, like, a rise in suicide rates? Okay.
As bad as the reformers claimed. Well, technically, No. In fact, the reformers struggled for years to find ways to criticize it, so simply resorted to making stuff up.
Of
Their
course.
smoking gun was the failure of the F111B, the Sea Pig. The Navy eventually refused to adopt the F111 after deciding they no longer needed a tactical nuclear-capable strike bomber, and instead what they needed was a tactical nuclear-capable strike fighter. Remember those factions that were arguing at the Pentagon over fighter bombers and dedicated fighters? By now they had come to an agreement to build the F-15, but the Navy didn't like this. The Air Force
Of
had
course.
brought in John Boyd, one of the more famous members of
Oh,
the
him
Reformers
again.
Club,
Hi.
to help them design an aircraft based on all the ridiculous specifications that had been proposed. Now, I've never seen those specifications. They do exist in an archive somewhere, along with what I'm told is plans for an F-111 with podded engines, which sounds absolutely hilarious, but I can't get into that archive unless I am a serving member of the US military. Most military archives in the US are either closed, open only to military personnel, or so underfunded, understaffed, and badly organized that trying to find anything in them is like trying to find an exceptionally small piece of hay in an impossibly large-sized pile of needles. This is why I laugh when people tell me, "Oh, I've been to an archive, actually," because they think it's like a library and everything's organized. They're not expecting to be led into something akin to the backrooms and pointed to a large pile of cardboard boxes all stacked on top of each other, some of which are inevitably damp and contain more dead flies and should be legally allowed. So, if any 4-star generals
Oh god. Yeah, stuff like that like really hurts me, where you have like this knowledge like of these at one time super sophisticated designs and these fascinating machines. And I mean, like, after the people who designed them are inevitably gone, all you have left are these like drawings and documents and stuff that are left in honestly horrible, or at least from the outside or at least from an outsider's perspective, like horrible conditions. Like, I've seen, and like you know, slight side tangent, but I've seen like recordings of what like the big archive in the Vatican looks like, and you go down in this little one-person elevator into this like cavernous, well, not cavernous, but like this huge like mess of corridors and like rooms that look like it's barely 6 feet tall, with just rows and rows of like shelves and like parchments and all this stuff, to the point where it like they don't know what they have down there, because there's just so much stuff in there that I don't think it's ever really been properly cataloged over the, you know, hundreds, or, you know, actually at this point thousands of years that the church has existed. And granted, it would be less severe in like one of these archives, I hope, but still.
Are watching this and feel generous enough to grant me an advisory position that gives me a service rank and a DoD card so I can visit these archives, that would be greatly appreciated. It also means I can technically apply for US citizenship for when I'm old and retired, because apparently you can buy a house in Alaska that's 200 miles from any known civilization, and that sounds quite pleasant if I'm honest. Anyway, what was I saying? Oh yeah, so Boyd is dragged into the F-15 program. I'll talk about that in detail.
Military strategist, right?
To say the plane Boyd and the rest of the reformers proposed, dubbed Project Redbird, had no missile payload and very little fuel. This was accepted at the time as the Air Force had been made development head of the project, and thus the F-15 was dictated as Air Force needs first, modified to naval needs later. This caused the Navy to walk out on the program, and now hating the Air Force even more, decided they needed their own high-speed jet interceptor capable of ground attack with a variable geometry wing.
I swear, at this point, it's like you're going around in a circle. We hear the exact same things. How many times?
F-111 simply wasn't designed to be a fighter. It had never been part of the original specifications, so the Navy canned it and would go on to build the F-14. The reformers saw this as their smoking gun. The Navy had dumped the expensive can't dogfight flying pig and gone for the more sleek dogfighter jet with a gun. Of course, and yes, I am fully aware the F-14 has a lot of fans who are very dedicated and can write out extravagantly long paragraphs faster than I can breathe, so I'm just digging my own grave at this point. The F-14 wasn't all sunshine and roses.
Of course it wasn't.
The F-14 tend to gloss over the early periods in which it was essentially just an expensive hangar queen. It was maintenance heavy, notoriously unreliable, and had a worse turning circle than the F-4 Phantom, an aircraft with a famously bad turning circle. But the thing is, the F-14 didn't need to be super maneuverable. In Iran, when it did encounter those highly maneuverable jet fighters that could dogfight like the reformers wanted, it won every single time. and not by outmaneuvering them, not by outturning them or using its gun, but because it could perform over-the-horizon attacks, striking at an enemy who weren't even aware
it was there.
Targeted. The reformers touted the F-14 because...
Again, what was I literally saying at the beginning of this recording? The whole point of like stealth and like longer range fire is just to kill somebody before they know you're even there, so they have less of a chance to kill you.
Because to them, it was an agile gunfighter, which proved that missiles and radar were dumb and expensive, and that air battles were decided by turning circles in a dogfight. But in reality, the F-14 proved the exact opposite. The F-14 was a long-range missile assassin. Even in red flag operations with international partners, NATO pilots would confess fearing a fight with the F-14 because it meant being hit by something you didn't know was there at a range you couldn't fire back at. And so it is with the F111. Everything the reformers hated about it was because it didn't need to be what they thought it should be. It didn't need to be maneuverable. It didn't need to have the pilots visually identify the target by looking at the ground. It didn't need to carry a shitload of bombs to destroy a single target. It didn't need a long loiter time or a titanium bathtub to protect the crew against people with guns shooting up at it. It could fly fast, it could fly low, and it could strike a target with pinpoint precision, wiping out anything from buildings, tanks, factories, and fortified positions with a single bomb, and then hightailing it out of there before the enemy could return fire. It was everything the modern bomber needed to be, and it proved that precision bombing wasn't a fantasy, it was a future.
Okay. You know, the more I hear about these guys, these reformers, just the whole group of them, the more I can't help but feel that they are just heavily delusional. Like, to the point where, like, I think they might need medical help. Because, like, because on one side, of course, there's, oh, what I want. But you have to be, you know, but of course you need to, like, be fully capable of saying, hey, what I want isn't going to work in real life. Like, a really basic example, I want what I want is the fact that, you know, steam locomotives were still, like, widely used on modern railroads. But, you know, for several reasons, environmental, manpower requirements, just all that sort of stuff, they're not. Alternatively, if we go to, you know, a military perspective, I've thought about this for a bit, just for, like, out of a lark, and if I was, you know, made Prime Minister of Canada, I would legitimately, like, start up a program to see, like, how viable it would be to have a couple of arsenal ships made for the Canadian Navy. And again, I say, like, a program to see if it's viable. Like, I know that, like, oh, these giant modern day, you know, missile battleship, well, I mean, they're not actual battleships, but, you know, like, oh, it's cool, you have these massive ships. But at the same time, I know that, one, super expensive, so, you know, Canada's not very famous for its military budget, but two, I mean, even if we had the budget to build those and we built them, like, would they even work with, like, Canada's naval, like, doctrine? I don't think they would, even if we could have them.
But the march of time goes on. With
Of
improving
course.
technology, it was becoming somewhat obvious that even the idea of low-flying bombers would soon be obsolete. Look-down, shoot-down radar was fast becoming a thing. A radar system which, when mounted onto a high point or an aircraft, could effectively screen out ground clutter, and anything traveling close to the ground, under the radar, so to speak, that got caught in this radar sight, would effectively be lit up like a Christmas tree. The system had been around since the late 60s, and now with its widespread adoption, including by the Soviets, the idea of flying low to avoid radar was quickly becoming a thing of the past. The F111
when it's
was
everywhere.
still a vastly superior bomber compared to its contemporaries, but the lessons learned from its use had been learned. Cheaper aircraft could now deliver the same bombs with the same precision. The one thing the F111 had been good at, flying low and fast, was no longer a trait exclusive to it. Although it would continue as a bomb truck, the Aardvark was solely regulated to high-speed reconnaissance and electronic warfare, but even then the maintenance cost of the aircraft was so vast, the fleet was allegedly sucking up around 25% of the Air Force's total maintenance budget. It would be retired from US service in 1993, with the last of the F111.
A single class of aircraft, 25%. Wow, okay. Yeah, definitely can see why it was retired before the Warthog.
A10 Still flying for the Australian Air Force until 2010. But the bomber wasn't dead. The problem had just become even more complicated.
Yeah, of
You
course,
have a
yeah.
plane that can sit high up, directing radar beams at the ground, and can spot aircraft flying low, and a regular radar keeping track of anything flying high. How do you get a bomber through without being detected? I mean, yes, you can take advantage of terrain and fly through mountain passes and riverbeds, where even look-down radar has stations, but
Yeah, but not everywhere has mountains or riverbeds like that.
you can't always rely on the enemy having a neat little line of mountain passes leading directly to the target you want to bomb.
And you'd think that a competent enemy would specifically fortify and protect such corridors of easy entrance.
They do, being naive enough to not suspect you probably use it to bomb them, and either be patrolling
Literally what I just
aggressively
said,
or
I'm
have
sorry.
some sort of early warning system in place. Effectively, you need another solution. And I know you've been ever so patient as this video drives 20 miles away from the point and then kicks you out the car and tells you to walk back. But that is where our humble little F117 finally comes in. Remember that? Remember what I was talking about before I started rambling? God, I am a terrible YouTuber. So, the question
No, you're a very
was,
good
why
YouTuber. This is
stealth?
exactly why we
Stealth
tune into
is
this
the
sort of
solution
stuff.
to the next problem. If you can't avoid radar, make something radar can't see. Simple. Easy peasy lemon squeezy, right? Well, no, it's lemon, lemon, difficult lemon. Radar can be tuned to detect something as small and as soft as a bird, which is essentially just a ball of feathers and anger. But if you can't hide a bird from radar, how do you hide a plane? Well, thankfully, in the 1940s, dates differ on who you ask, Lockheed, a company who builds planes, was approached by the American government and asked if they could build a plane. Now, normally, this wouldn't be a problem. Lockheed is really good at building planes. In fact, there's this big plane right outside their building to remind you that is what they do. But
Yes,
the
they're very
plane the
good
US
at it.
wanted was a weird one. It didn't have any propellers. They wanted a jet plane. This was weird because the US military had spent most of the 1930s claiming the idea of jet engines was a fad. They were unreliable, too mechanically complex, and too fuel-hungry to ever work. And then the Americans went on a fact-finding mission to Britain. Apparently, they were looking to buy the Mosquito, though some sources do differ. During the meeting, one American general leaned over to one of the engineers and chuckled, "You know, some people say we should be investing in jet engines." To which the engineer replied, "You should. You want to see ours?" Now, did that happen? I don't know. Probably not exactly like that. But the Americans got to see the Gloucester E-2839, Britain's experimental jet plane. And immediately, they bought one. And then they took it to Lockheed and said, "What can you do with this? Take the engine out, get rid of all this British shit, and make it more American. We want you to build us an all-American jet fighter." And Lockheed gently patted the general on the head and said, "Sure, we'll get right on that, sir." The problem was, Lockheed was busy making money. They were building planes. They were actually building planes for the British at the time, and they didn't feel like wasting all their money and some of their best engineers chasing a prototype for a plane that might never be built. It was madness. So what Lockheed did was it drove around America in a van collecting every sort of mentally unstable genius they could find. If you'd ever been questioned by the authorities for building a nuclear reactor in your bedroom when you were 12, if you'd built a rocket and tried to launch your old school hamster into space, if you were the kind of person who spent all their time building paper airplanes, obsessing over the design until they could fly hundreds of meters away, and then picked them up and ran through your house making noises while in your 30s, then Lockheed was rapidly approaching your location. They took all these aircraft engineers with questionable levels of sanity, dumped them into a circus tent, painted a large cartoon animal on the front, and watched to see what they would do. And thus, Lockheed Skunk Works was born.
And that is it for now. If you want to see the second part of this reaction, links to it are in the description in the top corner of the video, as well as it should be, appearing over my face any second now. I hope you guys liked. If you did, leave a like, subscribe if you have not, and I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.